I do want to start by saying, before we get into the meat of the presentation, that this research represents an absolutely huge team effort beyond, with a sort of team beyond the scale of any other study I've ever been involved in. So as well as myself and Glen, there's a large team at Heriot-Watt involved in it, including Janice Blenkinsop, one of our colleagues who's on the call and leads on a lot of the qualitative work. And we also work jointly with Kantar Public on the research, who deal with some of the fieldwork elements, and including a huge interviewing team across the country that's engaged in it. We also work jointly and are really very dependent on local coordinators from voluntary sector services in 18 areas across the country, and the 111 crisis services that work with us to implement the survey. So it's a huge kind of piece of work with lots of moving parts, and this is sort of the results of it we want to share with you today. So moving on to the next slide. As Laura has already mentioned, this is the fourth iteration of the study, and we've been doing it since 2015. This is the fourth time we've published reports in 2016, 2018, 2020, and now 2023. So the purpose of this most recent study was to update our national estimates of the overall scale of destitution in the UK to 2022. The last time we had estimated it was 2019. We want to identify trends with respect to the overall prevalence of destitution in the UK, and also its geographical and social distribution, and whether that was changing at all. We wanted to deepen our understanding of the drivers of destitution and the pathways in and out of it. And we also wanted to explore specifically the longer term impacts of COVID-19 and subsequently the cost of living crisis on levels and experiences of destitution. The last study we did, the survey was undertaken in 2019, and the qualitative interviews were undertaken actually just as COVID started. So in this study, we wanted to kind of update our understanding of what the longer term implications were of COVID, but also as we undertook the qualitative part of the work, the cost of living crisis had really taken a grip. So moving on to the next slide, please. Just want to say a little bit about the methods, because it is a pretty complex study, and you'll see at the bottom of this slide that there is a full technical report for those that are interested in sort of details of the methodologies. But it is a complex and pretty challenging study, and I just want to capture some of the flavour of that today. So for the first time in this series of studies, in the one that we conducted in 2022-23, we actually undertook some interviews with key stakeholders across the country before we started the main fieldwork. And this was in recognition of the fact that COVID-19, we thought, and we had reason to believe, had probably had quite an impact on the service sector that we are dependent on in order to do the destitution in the UK. Surveys. In particular, we'd picked up that there was a move towards more remote service delivery, particularly in the advice sector. And we also just wanted to sensitise ourselves more generally to how the world had changed since 2019 before we get into the main survey. We then did the sort of centrepiece of the project, and by far the most challenging aspect of it is a user survey, a survey of service users of 111 crisis services and 18 case studies across the UK. This was conducted in October, November 2022. We try and do the survey around the same time each year for trends analysis purposes, or each year we run the survey, we do it at the same time to sort of minimise seasonal variations and so on. So we did it in October, November 2022, and we generated 3,702 questionnaire returns, a very similar number to the number of returns we received in 2019. We then, or Glen, then undertakes secondary analysis of over 40 quantitative data sets to enable scaling up of our statistical findings from the survey in the 18 case study areas to national level. And that's one of the areas that the technical report goes into quite a bit of detail on for those that are interested in that. We then, we have a qualitative element to the study as well, and we undertook in-depth interviews with 31 people in spring 2023 who were destitute when surveyed in autumn 2022. I say a big theme there was the cost of living crisis and how that was affecting people at that point. I've already mentioned that one of the challenges that we had this time round was a change service modes in some sectors, particularly the device sector. This meant with the shift towards more remote service provision, and also delivery services for some food aid, for example, had moved to a delivery model, made the survey which we'd conducted, which was based on a paper survey within services, a bit more difficult to deliver. So that meant that we tested out and used an online version of the survey for the first time this year, and that meant that we had some hybrid and online modes alongside the established paper survey. We have to say we did a pilot of the online version of the survey before we undertook the main survey stage this year, and we found that the response rate was massively lower with the online version than with the paper survey. So we continue with the paper survey insofar as we possibly could, and only use the online mode where really it was completely unfeasible to use a paper survey, for example, in services that were delivered on a remote basis. We had a lot of practical difficulties, and we always have a lot of practical difficulties with this study, but we had a lot, perhaps even more this year than usual. We were beset by postal strikes, by very extreme weather in some of the weeks we were running the survey, which affected, the number of service users. Also, the cost of living payments actually hit in some of our fieldwork weeks, which again impacted on the levels of service users seen in some of the services. So there was a number of things that we had to either deal with practically in the field or deal with through weighting of data at the analysis stage. So for those that want more, there is more in the main report, but also in the technical report around methods. Moving on to the next slide. I think it's important to just to say, or to capture our definition of destitution that we use in this study, because we have a very specific definition that we developed right back in 2015, 2016, when we did the first round of the study. And we developed this based on the views of experts and also the general public, to give it that, I suppose, to give it protection from any sort of attacks from various political wings, and also, to avoid accusations that this was just sort of something that academics had made up. So their definition is twofold. People are considered destitute if they lack two or more of the following in the past month because they can't afford them: shelter, food, heating, lighting, clothing and footwear, and basic toiletries. And we have particular cut-offs for each of those, again, dependent on what at least half of the public felt constituted destitution. People are also considered destitute in our study if their income is so low and they have no savings such that they are unable to purchase these essentials for themselves. So we have both a deprivation and an income dimension to the definition of destitution. The income thresholds have, of course, been updated in the light of inflationary pressures and so on, and in particular over the last, obviously since the inflationary pressures in the last couple of years, there was quite a hike required in the income level this year. And we actually published something in February of this year based on analysis Glen had done on the relevant income levels. With that, I'll pass over to Glen to present the quantitative findings.
Thank you. And if we could move to the next slide, hoping you can hear me. This slide is probably the most important one, the single most important message from this study, this round of the study. It is about the scale of destitution and how much this has increased. We now estimating about 1.8 million households across the UK were destitute during 2022, and they contain 3.8 million people, of whom 1 million were children. And so these are all sharp increases since 2019, 61% in terms of people. If we go back to 2017, which the survey is also fairly comparable with, we're talking a more than doubling of the volume of destitution in that period. the number of children experiencing destitution has almost trebled since 2017. And this reflects one of the things we found in sort of analysing what's been going on is that there's been a large increase in the number of crisis services, I think partly post-COVID. But also within typical services, we also found that their caseloads were tending on average to increase. And that I think was most notably the case. Both of those things were most notably the case in the food bank sector. The survey design is complex, and those that wish can look at the relevant appendices in the technical report. But these increases are way beyond any confidence interval on the accuracy of the numbers, where we would talk about something in the 20% sort of margins. So this is definitely significant. And I'd like now to it's just one other thing to mention here is that the balance between, say, the income criteria and the material deprivations has changed a bit. It's a higher proportion of people are now experiencing destitution because they're lacking these basic essentials, say 75% compared to 67%. So in relative terms, the income criterion is slightly less important, but in absolute terms, they're both contributing to that. Could we perhaps go to the next slide now? So we're going to talk a little bit about the profile in some key respects. This slide looks at the household composition, and the story has always been that single people households have tended to dominate the picture, but families with children, particularly lone parents, are becoming more common. It's also the case that the profile tends to be younger than the general population, relatively few pensioners, but has become a little bit older since the last survey in 2019. But there's quite a lot of lone parents and multi-adult households here. Destitution also appears to be spreading out, both in the demographic sense as well as in other senses, from the established areas of concentration, such as people who are homeless with complex needs, to affect a wider range of people, and as we'll see in a minute, places. And we're now finding that about a third of destitute households contain children. So if we could go to the next slide. Concerns the sort of housing situation, where this is a sort of summary that in terms of whether people have their own home or in their various other types of temporary or non-household situations, and you can see that the blue line at the top has got longer, so nearly approaching 3/4 do have a flat or house of their own. That's a considerable increase on the previous survey, and correspondingly there's somewhat less is a proportion of the total of destitute people are within hostels, emergency accommodation, that kind of thing, or staying with parents, friends or partners, or indeed sleeping rough. In terms of the absolute numbers, most of those things have still been stable or increasing. There has been a slight decline between these particular years. There was a slight decline in rough sleeping based on other evidence, but there's still unaffordable, insecure, overcrowded or otherwise inappropriate nature of rented housing is still a major theme, and that comes out a lot in the qualitative interviews. Those that are in their own home, the great majority are living in rented, and including both social and private rented, with a bigger growth in private renting this time. If we go to the next slide. Another striking finding concerns disability. Using standard questions comparable with the census, we're finding a really high proportion, approaching 2/3 of destitute households have chronic health problem, and that's up from, significantly up from 54% to 62% from 2019. Men are more affected than women. And the whole, as many of this audience will know, claiming disability benefits can be a long and arduous process, and that's resolving that can be a key factor pulling people out of destitution. That emerges from some of the qualitative interviews. Men are being more likely to report disability than women, and it's much more what we call the UK other group. In other words, people who are born in the UK and don't fall into our category of complex need. Nearly 3/4 of them are reporting a disability. Within the complex need group, it's about 66%, 2/3. Within the other migrant group, it's much less, about 37%. And as already mentioned, so resolving problems with disability benefits can be key to actually getting people out of destitution in many of these cases. Could we go to the next slide, please? Ethnicity was asked in this survey for the first time, and the striking headline finding here, unfortunately, is that Black people are 3 times more likely to be destitute than would be expected on the basis of their population share, as can be seen from the third group of bars here. There are somewhat heightened risks also for mixed or multiple ethnic groups, but relatively even for the Asian and other ethnic groups. But that is, it's also the case that migrants, people born overseas, are at disproportionate risk, and there's strong links, obviously, for some of these between the 2 types of status. So it's still true that a great majority of heads of destitute households in the UK were born in the UK, but the risks for migrant groups are disproportionately high. And indeed, that part of the destitute population has grown particularly rapidly, and there's been a noticeable tendency for more of those households to have children. So migrant groups account for a major slice of the near doubling of children in destitution between 2019 and 2022. And obviously strong links between ethnicity and migration backgrounds, except for the white and the mixed multiple ethnic groups who tend to have been born in the UK. For Asian, Black and other ethnic group respondents, a clear and large majority were born overseas. So if we could perhaps, proportion born overseas was higher than their share in the overall working age population. So it does seem that being a migrant is a risk factor over and above, or sometimes in conjunction with, ethnicity. If we could go to the next slide, please. We asked people about the sources of financial support and also in-kind support. The picture on financial support is that, as in 2019, not much change here. By far the most prevalent source of income was social security benefits. Nearly 3/4 are in receipt of social security payments. This in itself is strong evidence of benefit inadequacy, because it's clearly not enough to keep them out of destitution. And you can see this when we looked at we've re-estimated our income threshold, and it's for destitution, it's now for single people and childless couples, it's working age, it's clearly above the level of the basic allowances in the universal credit system. This reflects a long-standing failure to keep these levels of benefit up to adequate level, which colleagues at the LSE have documented quite thoroughly in other studies. There was some rise in universal credit payments in April 23. In the qualitative research, most interviewees reported that had made little difference to them because it had been swallowed up by the rapidly increasing cost of basic necessities. And similar comments applied to the special cost of living payments, which were aimed at people on means-tested benefits and also some other groups, disabled and pensioners. They were viewed as welcome but limited and short-term in their impact. The main sources of financial support that changed a bit was a greater reliance on parents, rising from 22 to 28%, and on local welfare funds, which were playing a somewhat bigger role in 2022 than they had been in 2019. Of course, these were very discretionary in England at that time, but they have been brought back into use in the face of the COVID and cost of living crises. The migrant group, those with no complex need, are noticeably worse off, in that only about half of them received income from benefits. At the same time, they were less likely than the other groups to receive income from many of the other sources. Consequently, a quarter of the migrant destitute population reported having no source of money at all in the previous month, compared with about 10 to 15% from the other groups. If we could perhaps go to the next slide, please. We are then looking at sources of in-kind support. The most dramatic change in in-kind support can be seen at the top of this chart, which was the food banks, which jumped from 22 to 35% of destitute respondents reporting assistance from this source. So this increasing role of food banks is consistent with published data from the Trussell Trust, for example, and from our analysis of the increase in the number of services that I mentioned earlier, and was also a strong theme in the qualitative work. So the number of people receiving support from food banks, destitute people, rose from 214,000 in 2019 to 574,000 in 2022, an increase of 168%, and even larger numbers reporting the use of food banks or attending a food bank agency over the previous year. Next most important were parents. Their role has increased in relation to in-kind as well as money support. Again, migrants are the group that are much more likely than the other groups to say they received no in-kind support. If we were to go to the next slide, we have at a glance a picture of the geography of destitution in 2022. At a superficial glance would suggest this is similar to what we reported in previous years. These are quintiles destitution, the darker shading indicating the highest rates. To repeat, this analysis is based on a large number of secondary data sets. And we conduct this across Great Britain, although I would caution that we don't have quite the same availability of indicators for Scotland as we have for England, so there's a slight hesitation there, and we don't attempt to replicate this in any detail in Northern Ireland. The destitution rates are highest in London, and we've seen an increased concentration in London this time, which is a bit of a different trend from what we saw between 2017 and 19. Again, you see high rates in the former industrial areas across the north of England, the Midlands, South Wales, and West Central Scotland. Perhaps a little bit less emphasis on Scotland this time. A wider spread of places are now affected, and we saw some, when you look at the individual local authority level, you see quite a number of authorities sort of shooting up the list, and some of the ones that were previously very near the top slipping down a bit. So a widening out basically. And I think I'm now going to hand back to Suzanne with the next slide, probably.
Thanks very much, Glen. Yes, I'll pick up the story now with the more qualitative findings. As I mentioned at the beginning, we undertook, or Janice, my colleague Janice Blenkinsop undertook 31 interviews in spring of this year with people who were destitute at the point when we surveyed in the autumn of 2022. Worth making the point from the start here that 3/4 were still destitute at the point that we interviewed them. So that's kind of 4, 5, 6 months after they had been surveyed. The majority were still destitute at that point. And insofar as actually some of the small numbers of 8 had moved out of destitution, in most cases that was because they had had disability benefits sorted out, particularly securing PIP was the key route out of destitution. For most of the others were still destitute at the point when we interviewed them. A really key theme across all 4 iterations of the destitution in the UK study has been the crushing impact of debt on people on very low incomes. And this was very often what pushes people from living in poverty into being absolutely destitute. In our survey this year, quantitative survey, 56% of respondents were experiencing problematic debt and being behind on bills and so on. And in the qualitative work, this came through very strongly. As in previous iterations of the study, the debts were mostly associated with public debt of some kind, so debts to local authorities, debts to DWP and utility companies. But for the first time in this series of studies, we are seeing the emergence of more consumer type debt, often affecting people who had been in work until relatively recently, as is captured in the first quote here. Somebody talking about credit cards, catalogues and so on, and then when COVID hit and they lost their job, that's when they found these debts then unsustainable. The second quote captures the sheer sort of scale of debt and pressure that people can be under. This woman's talking about owing them thousands and not being able to pay it or else doing without food. This quote also mentions citizens' advice, and this was another key theme that emerged particularly this year, the importance of independent advice in helping people manage issues of debt, but also some of the housing issues that Glen mentioned that were a big concern for a lot of people facing destitution, and also, of course, issues with the benefit system. But access to those advice services, particularly since COVID, it seemed to become much more difficult. A lot of them have moved to online and remote type delivery, and this could make it difficult for people to access. And the final quote is actually from one of the national stakeholder interviews, where, and this was a point echoed by a number of the national stakeholders, when they're saying the advice sector in particular has really struggled to meet the level of need, pushing for an online route, but there's a need for more in-depth forms of support, and there's a real struggle to know how where to signpost people to get that more in-depth support. So there's a real sort of stretching of the support that people need in order to manage this crushing impact of debt, and resolving debt and through some debt DRO or something similar was often really what was required in order for people to move out of destitution as well, but it's very difficult to achieve. Moving on to the next slide, please. Another key theme, and again, this is one that's present through the study.
Often change.
Sorry, I don't know where that came from. One of the key themes that's run throughout the study over the 4 iterations is the role of the state and the sort of sense of withdrawal of the state from protecting people facing destitution, other than through the mainstream benefit system. And this came through even more strongly in this iteration than previous iterations of the study, other than with respect to accessing mainstream benefits, and in a small number of cases, local authority interventions to avert homelessness. We saw very little evidence of the state intervening. Fewer than a fifth of people had accessed local welfare assistance funds, for example. So families are then often taking the strain. And one of the most shocking findings, maybe the most shocking finding for me anyway, in the study this year, was the sheer consistency with which parents talked about having one meal a day. It was a very, very consistent story. I have one meal a day so that my children can eat. And these are 3 quotes that capture that phenomenon, but we could put plenty more quotes up where people say very similar things. It's always this theme about one meal a day so the kids can eat. And that is something I don't think we've seen quite to the same extent in previous studies, albeit that people do often skimp on food in order to meet other demands on their limited resources. But I think this sense of people sort of reducing what they eat down to one meal a day, particularly families with children, was a particularly key theme that came across strongly in this year's study. Moving on to the next slide. Another thing that came through very strongly in the qualitative work this time round was, we often talk about families and so on, but actually what we usually mean is mothers. So let's be a bit more specific about it. Support, particularly for adult children, usually who were struggling with destitution, usually came from their mothers. access to help from other family members, you know, fathers, siblings, and so on, was you know, just less common, more patchy, more conditional. So people weren't able, for whatever reason, to rely on help from their mother. They really were in a very dire situation. So these quotes capture some of that support that people do. At least some of our interviews were gaining from their mothers. The first quote there is about someone who is facing particular difficulties because she has a daughter with a disability, which means they have to pay for additional toiletries, which are not covered in NHS, and they can't afford from their very limited resources. The quote also captures another key theme that came through, which Glen's mentioned in terms of the quantitative work, but also came through in the qualitative work, is the very the sort of profound impact of disability, and or you know, the huge importance of disability when you're talking about destitution. It was, I think, 20 out of the 31 interviews had disability themselves, and an additional 7 had someone in the household who had a disability. So the great majority of people we're talking about in terms of these qualitative interviews were struggling with disability on top of extremely low income and material deprivation. Another couple of points I just want to raise about this kind of reliance people had on their mothers where they could to help them manage destitution is that very often their mothers themselves would be struggling with a very low income, and that's captured in the second quote. You know, my mum will help me where she can, but it's whether she's got it or not, because she struggles as well. And the third point I want to make is relates to this final quote here about how humiliating it is for adult children to have to rely on their mothers. And we had some, you know, men in their 50s who were having to kind of ask their mothers to help them to keep body and soul together. So it's pretty embarrassing, you know. This man says, you know, mum, when she comes round, she'll notice that they don't have a lot in and get a shop in for us. Doesn't like asking, but if they have to, they will. And we did also have some evidence of that, of mothers and to some extent other family members being quite diplomatic in some ways in how they offered help, you know, just noticing that people didn't have much in and saying, oh, I'll just get a few extra bits when I do my shopping and so on, because they're sensitive to how humiliating and embarrassing it is for people to have to ask. Moving on to the next slide, the other key source of support which has come out very strongly in the quantitative work, as Glen's already presented, is reliance on food banks. Basically, the two sources of help people had were either their mothers or food banks. Everything else was fairly minor, and any other source of support tended to be fairly minor in comparison. But as with relying, when you're an adult, on your mother for, you know, your most basic physical needs, relying on food banks is also humiliating, or as this first the quotation captures, degrading. This has been a really strong theme all the way through the study, as well, is that no matter how nice people are in food banks, and they often are very nice, very supportive, very sensitive to the situation people are in, it is always degrading, it is always humiliating, having to throw yourself on the mercy of strangers for to meet your most basic physiological needs. And that is something that, you know, people again told us this year. There are also practical issues with reliance on food banks. You know, the lack of fresh food, as is captured in the second quote there about tinned food and so on. But also the quantity as well as the quality of food can be an issue. I mean, food banks are only able to offer parcels for short periods of time, usually 3 days, say from Trussell Trust, and there are restrictions on how often people can use food banks as well. So they do often tell us about running out of food when you know, and they can't go back to the food bank for a few days. People often talked about, you know, doing without food at the end of the week or over the weekend. And the final quote there I've included just because I think it's such a telling quote, and actually it sort of reflects my own personal journey on food banks in the UK. This stakeholder said, we used to worry about food banks opening, now we're worrying about food banks closing. That's how bad it is now. I mean, the food banks are effectively playing a pretty heroic function at the moment, particularly for groups like migrants who often have access to very little other support. They've become institutionalised as part of the welfare response, but that raises all of the issues that I've just went over just now. You know, it's humiliating, it's shaming, and practically it really doesn't keep people from hunger. So moving on to the next and final slide. Clearly what we've laid out here is a pretty desperate situation in the UK. You've got destitution not only increasing in scale sharply, accelerating, but also spreading out to affect a wider number of people and a wider number of areas of the country. So clearly urgent action is needed to stem this rising tide of destitution, which does disproportionately affect vulnerable migrants, but the great majority, 3/4 of people affected by destitution in the UK are UK nationals. So this is something that's reaching into all parts of society where people are having to get by on low incomes. It's no longer a kind of unusual occurrence for people to be absolutely destitute. So the actions, we lay out a number of policy priorities in the report, but I just want to capture sort of 4 headline or broader areas where we think action is urgently needed. The first area, the most important one, actually, is the basic level of mainstream welfare benefits. Universal credit has to provide a protected minimum amount of support to enable people to purchase essentials for themselves if we want to move away from a society in which destitution is a sort of mass experience as it is at the moment. And that means introducing the principle which Joseph Rinchie Foundation, Trust and others have been pushing through their Essentials Guarantee, that there should be this protected minimum, that there should be this residual income that people have that enable them to buy the essentials for themselves without having to rely on charity or their mothers or other insecure and inappropriate ways of having to meet your most basic needs. And this minimum benefits deductions for debt and sanctions where applied should not be allowed to reduce support below that level. Unless we take these steps, then we're going to continue to have large-scale destitution in the UK. There are also some more specific areas where urgent action is needed. The prevalence of disability and issues with disability benefits run right through the destitution story in the UK, even more so this year than in previous iterations. We first asked the standard disability question in 2019. It had come through in the qualitative work in the first and second iterations, but we asked the disability question, the quantitative part of the study for the first time in 2019. But as Glen has outlined, the extent to which people report disabilities within the destitute population has increased significantly, even since 2019. And the qualitative work has consistently showed that enabling people to access disability benefits to which they are entitled is a key route, if not the key route, for destitution to be resolved. Now, people are not then well off. They are very often moved out of destitution into poverty, but at least they are not absolutely destitute once they've secured those benefits. So that's very, very important that we do something about that system. Another key area for action, particularly in England, is to ensure that cash first emergency financial assistance is available to everyone who needs it, including people with no recourse to public funds. Now, many people on this call will probably be aware that in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, there is still effectively a national local welfare assistance scheme. That's no longer the case in England. This has been devolved to local areas, and while it's been revived to some extent during COVID and with the Household Support Fund, it's still a very patchy picture in England. The recent Homelessness Monitor England report that we published a few months ago, we had the launch event last week, and we were discussing at that event that I think it was only around 2/3 of local authorities that responded to our survey reported they actually had a local welfare assistance fund in their area. But this emergency financial assistance from the state is absolutely crucial in keeping people from experiencing absolute destitution and is a real priority, particularly in England. And finally, and something that's come through much more strongly in this round of the study than in previous rounds, is the importance of access to free and impartial advice services. Now, increasingly difficult that is becoming. I think investment in that sector is required. While the online support that can be offered, or telephone support that can be offered by advice services, very often what people need, there is also a need for face-to-face services and some more in-depth support, particularly for more vulnerable groups, because this is absolutely crucial to addressing the debt, benefits and housing issues that keep people destitute. I'll leave it there, and hopefully we've got a little bit of time for discussion and questions.